Okay, so Section 6 is essentially on the women's movement. And although the women's movement is not going to be successful for a while, this is essentially the start of it and how the women's that continues later on through history started. And it starts a spirit of reform permeated American life in the early and middle 1800s. Women took active roles in the abolition movement and other reform movements. Soon, some of the other reformers began to gain or to work to gain equality for women as well. Their efforts would lay the groundwork for the women's struggles for equal rights over the next 100 years. At the time, women's rights were incredibly limited. Women typically couldn't hold property, they couldn't hold office, and they couldn't vote. They were discouraged from speaking in public. Divorce, even though it was a faux pas when it happened, men essentially got all property and even got custody of the children, and so the children would be taken away if sort of women were divorced, and they also couldn't seek divorce. Men typically had to start the process. But with sort of the changing times, many women were one, sort of being the converts to these new churches and joining these reform movements, as well as advancing their education through the public school system and the public school reforms. And then you also had people like Sojourner Truth, who was a former slave in New York, giving abolition lectures and becoming public speakers. Women were also working outside of the home for the first time in U.S. history in large numbers because of the market revolution and that sort of industrialization. And with that, they gained some economic independence, especially those that were unmarried, even though they were typically offered lower wages than men. And this is one of the reasons that some factories, like the Lowell Mills, had a tendency to hire women, is because they had to pay them less. Few women's unions are even going to be formed, although remember that labor unions in general were not successful during this time frame. So again, political and economic status of women in the early 1800s. Women could not vote. They could not hold public office. Women could not serve on juries. Few women were able to receive any level of higher education. Women couldn't typically work in most trades or professions. When they did work, they're paid less than men for the same jobs, and their fathers or husbands typically took what money that they should earn due to their lack of property rights. Married women typically lost all legal control of any money and property they owned before marriage to their husbands. Married women could not testify against their husbands in court, sue for divorce, or gain custody of their children. Typically, the group of people that actually had the most rights in women were widowed women. Women's clothes in the 1800s typically limited movement. They symbolize the restrictions sort of placed on women's lives. They were not the most comfortable or practical. Although many women began leading reformers, many others entered the workforce. There had still been virtually no progress in the women's rights movement. Real progress began only when two historical trends coincided in the 1830s. First, many urban middle class northern women began to hire servants to do their housework, allowing these middle class women more time to think about society in which they wanted to raise their children. Second, some abolitionist women began to notice some similarities between the slavery and the restrictions placed on their own lives. The origins of the women's rights movement tended to coincide with the abolition movement. The women's movement overall is a movement working for greater rights and opportunities for women. Some of your advocates for the women's rights movement is Margaret Fuller, who was a transcendentalist and a writer, and then the Grimke sisters, which sort of argued that God made men and women equal, therefore they should be treated equally. Uh, just because people were in the women's movement didn't necessarily mean, however, that they agreed. You had some disagreements, one most notably over the women's right to vote, and then two, whether they would allow men in the movement. Two of the other active leaders are Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were active reformers supporting temperance and abolition. And during the 1800s, middle class women were seen as domestic caretakers and moral guardians of the home. And essentially, this is sort of the idea of Republican motherhood, that their place in politics was also from sort of their rearing nice sort of male citizens that would help found sort of the morals of society, that their roles are as mothers and not as participants. This chart gives you some of the social mobility as well as the literacy rates of women, as well as sort of women in public and primary education as teachers. And you can see that that eventually becomes sort of a male dominated field as we go into the 1900s. In 1848, Mott and Stanton are going to help organize the nation's first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls. And if you know nothing else from the women's movement, you need to know the Seneca Falls Convention. It's often called the Seneca Falls Convention. The meeting attracted hundreds of men and women. One of the most illustrious participants was Frederick Douglass. The delegates to the convention adopted a Declaration of Sentiments modeled after the language of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Sentiments was ridiculed, and the convention resulted in very few concrete improvements in the women's rights. It did, however, mark the beginning of the women's rights movement in the United States. Other inspiring women that we haven't mentioned yet, one is Amelia Bloomer, who attended the Seneca Falls Convention. She was really young when she did so and didn't participate a whole lot. But because of that foundation, she would then become a leading voice in the women's rights movement in the future. Susan B. Anthony was the leader in sort of the women's suffrage movement, which is the women's right to vote. It's why uh, in recent elections you've seen Susan B. Anthony's grave site, her tombstone sort of covered in the I voted stickers because she was such an advocate for women's suffrage. They were slightly successful in a few pieces of legislation. Most notable was in 1848, New York passed the Married Woman's Property Act, which guaranteed property rights for women. And then 12 years later, they amended it to make it even broader, and some states were able to follow suit with that, at least giving women some rights to property. This cartoon depicts the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848. Um, that was essentially not always depicted in the best light, but I'll let you read the rest.